how villages and towns in Bengal dressed London ladies in the 17th, 18th and early 19th centuries. This is a new and exciting project by Stepney Community Trust. For several centuries, textiles from Bengal, especially muslin, were worn by fashionable London women. This initiative aims to help reveal the story of muslin, the famous textile of Bengal, and bring that little-known Bengal-British connection to light.
If you go back to the 17th and 18th centuries, Bengal was still a largely agrarian society, but there was also a very large home or craft industry based on this muslin cloth, which was produced by weavers using actually quite simple technology. It was spinning, weaving, using a crafts-based industry. It wasn't factory production in the way that we understand the textile industry today, but it was a precursor to factory production. It's how actually factory production begins, with simple spinning and weaving, and it was done at home by weavers. And these weavers weren't very rich, but collectively they produced a product which had global markets. And Bengal muslin had a market in the Middle East, it had a market in Southeast Asia, and there were trading networks which took it even further to Europe. And we know that there were markets as far as England, and that is why actually the East India Company came. They wanted to trade in muslin, in spices, and other things that were produced in the Bengal economy. So when we say that Bengal was prosperous, we need to put it in context. It was still a relatively poor economy, but there were many jobs in the production of muslin and in the fabric that muslin was. It was a very fine fabric with a global market. It also, therefore, Bengal had a very large urban population. Dhaka at that time, in the mid-18th, early 18th century, was a bigger city than most European cities. In fact, it was a huge city. And the basis of this urban population was the production of this textile, muslin, and also the trading networks that operated selling it globally. So it was a very big industry in terms of the number of people employed. It made Dhaka a bigger manufacturing center than Manchester at that time. But still, I think it's very important for us to understand that, relatively speaking, Bengal was prosperous, but in absolute terms, it was still a poor economy. And the next stage of development would have been the conversion of this muslin into factory production, but that process was disrupted by the colonial impact, because the colonial impact destroyed the muslin industry before it could go from a crafts-based industry to a factory-based industry.
The first place that the East India Company visited in the Indian subcontinent was Gujarat in 1607, primarily to buy Indian textiles for exchange for spices from the Indonesian Spice Islands. Then, from 1640, when the company established a base in Madras in South India, now known as Chennai, another important centre was added to its sources of textile. The third centre, which became the most important one, subsequently was Bengal, from where the company started to purchase textiles from around 1660s. By 1725, Bengal's contribution to East India Company's textile export was bigger than the other two centres combined, and this continued throughout the 18th century.
Muslin, one of the absolute fantastic documentation, the Portuguese monk Sebastian Martinez, when he came in 1640, he wrote pages and pages about this muslin and how impressed he was. I have got the quotes, but I don't know how to give you the quotes. But that is one of the sources. It was a fantastic textile industry in Bengal. We have documentation when Dhaka became, because Dhaka, talk about anywhere else, the cities are the reservoir of all kinds of things. They are the repository of knowledge, at the same time cities were used for destruction of other things. But in 1610, the Mughal Nawab established Dhaka as a capital. From Raj Mahal to Dhaka came in 1610. And one of the reasons came because Dhaka was flourishing at that time. All the Dhaka's got, it is situated, the waterways particularly, as we all know, everybody knows, it is situated on Buriganga and is crisscrossed by creeks, Dulai Khal, famous, all these things are there in Dhaka. And the trade was flourishing all over through the internal waterways. So the Mughals chose Dhaka, and they were very impressed by the muslin. And 1610, they were highly impressed by all the textile industries and the artisans of Dhaka, what they're doing. And, they used Dhaka, as you know, not only because of the textile industry already there, but they used it because of the waterways. They could go, the advances from there to Chittagong, the advances to Arakan, their advances to Assam, all this. They fought against the Portuguese Afghan rebels. All these things they used for their naval expeditions from Dhaka, waterways and others. And they were impressed by the trades. Like Monk Sebastian wrote about how international communities in Dhaka, how it is. He said that so much money that they could not count the money. The money could not be counted. They were weighed. It's written in his book, in his memoirs, that the money was weighed. So you can see, and they're all over the world. He's going to Turkey, going to Armenia, going to Greece. He writes about all these things. That's one of the documentation.
The provinces of Bengala are very extensive and are much frequented by foreigners, owing to the trade there both in foodstuffs, as I have remarked above, as also in fine cloth. So extensive is the trade that over 100 vessels are yearly loaded up in ports of Bengala with only rice, sugar, fats, oils, wax, and other similar articles. The finest and richest muslins are produced in this country from 50 to 60 yards long and 7 to 8 handbreadths wide. So fine indeed are these muslins that merchants place them in hollow bambus, about 2 spans long, and thus secured carry them through Khorasan, Persia, Turkey, and many other countries.
Well, in the Western European collections, I think I estimate about 50 to 60, but these include wedding dresses, baby gowns, and it depends how you define dress, so that's always a problem using the catalogues. But that is only the tip of an iceberg, because there were also many beautiful muslin accessories that were used, and muslin was an expensive fabric in the 17th and 18th centuries, and so they were also used for making little shawls called fishu that you would tie around your neck, which were often embroidered, collars, ruffs, cuffs, and we have a number of very beautifully embroidered muslin aprons that would probably have been used Indian muslin. Most of the objects we have in the muslin objects we have in the museum are from possibly the late 18th century or mostly 19th century, and probably because muslin is a very fragile material and tore easily and wasn't in any case very suitable for our climate. So they were quite expensive probably at the time. Muslin was an expensive fabric, so it would have been the better off people who wore it. And possibly some of the dresses got cut down for children and babies, or handed down, and they just wore out, I think probably became rags. Well, it's very difficult to tell exactly, because the earlier muslin, which in the 17th and early 18th century would definitely have come from Bengal, or possibly some other parts of India, no longer survives. So what we have dates from the 19th century, by which time there was a big production of muslin in England and Scotland and even France, and sometimes it's very hard to tell them apart, although the West never produced the extremely fine muslins that you get from the Dhaka area of what is now Bangladesh. No, unfortunately, there's a bit of a mismatch between the historical records of the East India Company and the objects that survive in this museum and other museums as well, for reasons which I've described. So we have a good collection, but it mostly dates from the early 19th century onwards. And that was the time when there was this great fashion for classical style dress, or what we call empire style or neoclassical, very simple gowns with a high waist, plain or embroidered muslin, sometimes embellished with beads, things that would glitter in the candlelight. And that fashion went on for about perhaps 30 years and was very popular, even though it wasn't terribly good for such a cold climate as England. But of course it brought with it a fashion for cashmere shawls. You'd wrap the shawl round your rather flimsy dress to keep you warm. So there was a huge import of cashmere shawls, and because these were very expensive, they were then copied in Britain, Scotland and France, and thereby sort of debased the whole thing, and so they sort of then eventually went out of fashion.